Okay, the name of, I'm Bob Walker. And I was in World War II in Europe. I went into the Army about 1 week after D-Day and was there in combat for about 5.5 months. Finally got wounded in the Hertzman Forest just across the line from Belgium into Germany. So this is an account of one of my early battles. One of the 2 times that I was missing in action, officially. Okay, it's called Carentan, fixed bayonets. This was the Battle of Carentan. A dried up swamp stood between us and the Germans. Our military staff had been studying the German side through binoculars and came to the conclusion that there was little activity out there. They therefore assumed that there was not much there to challenge us. To minimize the risk, they decided to implement a dawn attack with fixed bayonets. This was the only time during my whole 5.5 months of combat that we were asked to mount bayonets. We were told to refrain from firing our rifles unless absolutely necessary. I suppose to maximize the effect of surprise during darkness. We were told to move out under cover of darkness, supported by a creeping artillery barrage, tracking our advance, and exploding just out of range in front of us as we were advancing. It was still dark as we were approaching the far side of the swamp, when more machine guns than you could immediately count opened up on us. I immediately dropped to the ground to minimize my exposure to the machine gun fire, and then tried, without success, to ascertain where the rest of my squad was located. I was so close to a German machine gun position that I could hear the crew talking among themselves and occasionally pull back the bolt on their machine gun. Just before it got light, I dismounted my bayonet, cut back the thick turf, and fashioned a small slip trench into which I moved. As it was getting light, I raised my head to look around for other members of my squad, but saw none. Since I never saw the other 11 members of my squad again, I can only surmise that they panicked when they came under fire and fled, further exposing themselves, and died of machine gun fire while fleeing. At this point, we were practically all replacements since D-Day, and many of us, with very little training and experience, and sometimes reacting stupidly under baptism by fire. Anyway, being in such a precariously close position to a German machine gun, I decided to play dead until I could crawl out of there under cover of darkness. Occasionally our own artillery shells would land close by and I would get sprayed with mud and dirt. When evening came, there was a small moon in the sky. The ground was too well illuminated at that time to risk me out. I waited until close to midnight when a few wispy clouds had appeared. As soon as they hid the face of the moon, I started crawling as fast as I could to the other side of the swamp. About 15 feet from the other side, I stood up and got challenged. By that time, the password and countersign had been changed and I had no way of knowing what they were. Also, the common backup procedure was to ask a question concerning sports celebrities or sports statistics that the enemy wouldn't be expected to know. Since I absolutely had no interest in sports, that procedure had little chance for success. As luck would have it, the person challenging me recognized me. In the replacement depot in England, I had been put in charge of an 8-man squad consisting of myself and 7 Indians from the western part of the United States. He was one of those Indians. Digressing for a moment, when I was put in charge of those 7 Indians in the replacement depot, I was 19 years old, without any leadership training or skills. I had very little control over them, and they literally walked all over me. We were kind of isolated at the end of the company street, which ended at the top of a hill. Early every morning, we were required to stand reveille in the company street. The fog was always so thick that you could hardly see a person 10 feet from you. I couldn't get them up for formation, and so I would stand out there all by myself, enveloped in fog, and at the appropriate time would yell, "First squad, all present and accounted for." Then I'd crawl back into bed, and there's no one except the Indians being wiser. Getting back to the main story, I asked my challenger where Company B might be located. He didn't know, but directed me to Battalion Command Post, which was a French farmhouse next to a road going back into the woods. I followed the road to the farmhouse and saw the battalion commander pacing back and forth with a machine pistol in his hands. I could hear German burp guns in the distance on 3 sides of us. Burp guns were machine pistols with such a high firing rate that each burst of fire sounded like a burp. I asked where Company B was located, and he replied, "Wish to hell I knew." He asked me if I knew the location of any German 88mm gun emplacements, which I didn't. Then he said, "There are a few stragglers like yourself inside the farmhouse. Go in and join them." I joined them and was told that a German 88mm shell came into the attic, bounced around, and never exploded. The next night, because of our losses, we were spread very thinly. I was deployed with 3 others in a field surrounded by a hedgerow. We had a foxhole at each end of the field, each occupied by 2 people. The instructions were that in each foxhole, one man must stay awake and alert while the other man must sleep. It was my turn to be alert and let the other man sleep. I focused my attention on a break in the hedgerow in the direction of the enemy. I saw a shadow appear and start to move at the break. My immediate thought was that an enemy soldier was trying to penetrate our lines. I immediately pulled the pin out of my hand grenade and started kicking the other guy in the foxhole with me. Then, much to my surprise, the shadow turned into a donkey, rising up out of a gully at that break in the hedgerow. At this point, I was trying to put the pin back into the grenade. My hands were trembling so badly that it became a very difficult task. I finally accomplished it. On the following day, new replacements were brought up to cover the losses. They planned to reconstitute my squad with 11 replacements and put me in charge. I said, no thanks. I declined the offer of the promotion. However, I noticed that from that time on, I was frequently assigned as the point man or lead scout. Quite often we would get new replacements, and within a few days they would end up as casualties. They just couldn't keep a continuous low profile, and at some point would unnecessarily expose themselves and catch enemy fire. And now I digress. During the 55th anniversary Deep Day tour, which was last June, which I went on with my son. As our tour bus left Normandy heading toward Paris, our tour director, Mrs. Lyle Smith, asked if any one of us 6 veterans would like to relate some experiences during our boring ride to Paris. Nobody was making the move, so I finally grabbed the mic and related the story I just told. When I came to the part about the creeping artillery barrage, the veteran sitting next to my son said, "And guess who supplied that artillery barrage?" Him, of course. He drove a self-propelled artillery piece that looked like an armored tank with a huge gun on it. He was a member of a field artillery unit that at times supported my 8th Infantry Regiment. Half of his original unit ended up in a watery grave trying to get to Utah Beach. I didn't have any trouble relating my experiences, probably because of my weekly attendance at a PTSD therapy session. That stands for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. And I have those sessions at the VA Medical Center in Manchester, New Hampshire, where we had plenty of practice relating stressful combat experiences to each other and to the therapist. Needless to say, that broke the ice, and the other 5 veterans on the board each related an experience, after which I related another experience, namely the breakthrough at St. Louis. That being the second time I was listed as missing in action, and the previous one being the first.
In front, it was written by my sister Rose Freeman, and we're reading just an excerpt from it. Edgar enlisted in the U.S. Navy in December of 1942. He was assigned to Bainbridge Training Center in Maryland on February 23, 1943, and he was called to active duty. By that time, James and I were settled in East Hartford, Connecticut. On Edgar's free weekends, he boarded a train to New York, then changed for Hartford. We would meet him at the train station, or he would take a bus to our house. If we were not in at the time, he knew the location of the Iceman's Key. He was happy to get some good home cooking and see how the rest of the world lived at that time. James and I were happy to ease his training days. At one point, my parents came to visit us on a weekend when Edgar was expected, and it was a great reunion. Then Edgar was shipped out as an electrician's mate on a destroyer Shay. He and Richard were assigned to the same Pacific area. They crossed paths in Hawaii and followed each other to Okinawa. They were able to contact each other a few times. They had a password which the men on the plane and the ship would ID the other from either source. They were watchful and would help the brothers make contact whenever the occasion arose. In May 1945, Edgar's picture fell off our wall in East Hartford. I started to scream and yell, "Something has happened to Edgar." I wrote to Richard, and Richard had sent a note saying that regardless of what I heard about Edgar, he was all right. Later I learned that his ship, the Shay, had been hit by a Barker bomb, and 1/3 of the men were killed. Edgar had just left that area of the ship. The damage was repaired enough to be able to return to the States for more extensive work. Before returning to the battle area, peace was declared. Throughout the war years, my father made notes of his son's locations and activities from enlistment to discharge. On September 10, 1945, he writes that his 5 children were home together for the first time in nearly 3 years, and we had a family dinner. After 55 years, our best guess is that the dinner was my mother's famous roast beef with brown potatoes, onions, and freshly picked vegetables from the garden. The dessert definitely would have been apple pie made with apples from my father's trees. My parents felt that they had much for which to be thankful. Their children experienced the feeling that there is no place like home.